get talking, do you want to start there? Because we kind of left off last week with the theology. So let's talk about Arminius real quick. He's here at the end of this. Who's that? Yeah, they are. Yeah. Okay, see, here's the trick. Remember, we get this. There's difference between Reformed and Reformation. Does that make sense? Those are two, they sound very close, but they're two very different things. Lutheranism is part of the Reformation. Reformed is part of the Reformation. The Anabaptists are part of the Reformation, right? That's one big event with all these little branches under it, okay? Reformed is a denomination. That's what it's going to be. In the same way that Lutheranism is a denomination, Reformed is a denomination that's going to lead into Presbyterians and Episcopalians and eventually Baptists too. So there you go.
So
We come from that line. We don't come from the other line. We don't come from Lutheran. Now that I got Alonzo here, we can have some fun with this. We're gonna have fun tonight. If you're Catholic, you're not gonna have a fun time today. We need to talk about Arminian real quick, because we'll start with the. I'm just reading on my phone. I didn't have my highlighter when I was getting ready here.
do you need a highlighter?
No, too late. Okay, so, Holland, Netherlands, right here. We'll talk a lot about it when we start talking about the nations and stuff. Remember that we talked about Calvinism and the tulip thing, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. You get all that, Trey? Good. Glad you got it. Okay. That is Calvinism. Again, Calvin didn't come up with tulip. People after him came up with tulip as a way to simplify it. One thing we do owe Calvin for, undeniably, is the rediscovery of substitutionary atonement. So whereas Martin Luther came up with justification, or didn't come up with it, but he rediscovered it, I guess you could say, after Roman Catholicism, Calvin rediscovered substitutionary atonement, which is the idea that Jesus died in our place as a substitute for our sins, right? You've heard me preach that over and over and over again. We believe that. All of us in here believe that. Before Calvin, it was ransom theory of the atonement, that Jesus died as a payment to Satan so that Satan would set us free and we would become children of God, not children of Satan, right? Two very different ideas, okay? Okay, anyways, so let's see here, Arminius would be, found the dates for Joseph, James Arminius? It's James, not Joseph. Yeah. 1560 to 1609, okay? Have you got that ready? Good. Okay, good. You got the power of the phone. All right. 1560 to 1609. This is going to compare and contrast Arminianism with Calvinism. Okay. So pay attention to this. This is the debate which is brought forward today between Calvinism and Arminianism, which really before that it was Augustine and Origen. Okay. So both Arminian and Calvin taught that man who inherited Adam's sin is under the wrath of God. But Arminius believed that a man was able to initiate salvation after God had granted him primary grace to enable his will to cooperate with God. Now, that one sounds kind of like a cop-out to me, right? Let me read it again so you got it, okay? So still believes in predestination, but he would base his arguments of predestination based upon God's foreknowledge. And so this is the simple conundrum you run into with foreknowledge and predestination. God already knows everything that's going to happen. Therefore, nothing can happen other than what God already knows is going to happen. Make sense? So those who are going to be saved, God already knows who they are who are going to be saved. Therefore, no one can be saved except the ones who God already knows are going to be saved. You see it? Okay, you didn't catch that? I was to say it. So,
But it wasn't predetermined, it was just foreknown.
right, it's foreknown, but either way, your will still can't play much of a part in it, right? So, but anyway, so that's what he is going to say in regards to, let's see, Arminius accepted election, but believed that the decree to save some and damn others had its foundation in the foreknowledge of God. Thus, election was conditional rather than unconditional. And Calvin, on the other hand, accepted unconditional election by a sovereign God to grace and condemnation. Okay? So, go get that? No. Okay. Let me read it again. It seems like, okay, let's try it again. Okay. Arminius accepted election, but believed that the decree to save some and damn others had its foundation in the foreknowledge of God. Thus, election was conditional rather than unconditional. So in other words, Arminius believed that God chose people based upon his foreknowledge of them choosing him. Does that make sense? Okay. Different than what Calvin says. Calvin says that election is based solely off of God's sovereign will. All right?
Unconditional.
Unconditional. Yes. Conditional versus unconditional. So the condition that you're going to choose him, therefore he chose you, or the unconditional of God saying you're saved because I chose you to be saved. Yes. So Arminius accepted election. We already read that 3 times. So Arminius also believed that Christ's death was sufficient for all, but is efficient for only believers. Okay? Now, we talked about this when we talked about the atonement, right? So let me read that statement for you again. Arminius believed that Christ's death was sufficient for all, but it was efficient only for believers. So the difference between sufficiency and efficiency. So that is the idea that it could save everybody, but it's only going to save those who believe. Does that make sense? You paying attention, Trey? Pay attention. I got no word for ADD in here today. You got to learn this stuff. All right? Okay. So, sufficient, but only efficient for believers. Right? As opposed to Calvin's view of the atonement, that it only applied to those who would believe. You with me? Two different ways of getting there. They're saying things that sound very similar, but they're across two different lines here, okay? Okay, and also what that does to the atonement, it takes the atonement, in other words, Jesus' death on the cross doesn't actually pay for sin, it potentially pays for sin. So you gotta be careful with that.
So that's dealing with limited atonement there.
Do what?
That's dealing with limited atonement.
No. Because
Calvin.
yeah, Calvin is limited. Limited means that that it's not a potential payment of sin, it is the payment of sin. What Arminian is saying is that the atonement is a potential payment of sin. Right? That it could potentially pay for the sins of all these people who would believe. But it depends on whether or not they believe or not, as to whether or not it did actually pay for their sin. Right?
I have a problem with 1 John 2:1.
Okay?
Where it says that Jesus paid for the sins of the whole world. And
Right.
And that's not universalism.
Calvinistic instance on perseverance of the saints by stating that God would give saints grace so that they need not fall, but that Scripture seemed to teach that it was possible for man to fall away from salvation. Okay? So whereas Calvin has a hard line on the perseverance of the saints, that once you're saved, you're always saved, right? That's the perseverance of the saints in modern day lingo, is once saved, always saved. Arminius taught that, well, God's grace makes it so that those who are saved will stay saved, but it is possible for them to lose salvation. What? Okay? So, I think we would draw a pretty hard line there on the last part with Arminius, as far as the possibility of losing salvation.
Did he believe that it was irresistible grace?
Arminian?
No, Calvinist.
Calvin teaches the grace is irresistible. Yes.
So in Acts chapter 7, the sermon of Stephen, it says, you always resist the Holy Spirit as your fathers did. It says,
Test this guy out.
you men who are stiff-necked and
Yes.
circumcised in heart, and ears always resisting the Holy Spirit, you are doing just as your fathers did. Always resisting the Holy Spirit. So can the Holy Spirit be resisted? According to Calvin, then you cannot resist it. According to Stephen, you can resist it.
Yeah, so that was what we talked about when we talked about irresistible grace last week, does it mean irresistible in the sense that the first time you hear the gospel, if you're one of God's elect, you must answer to it, like you will respond? Or does it mean that if you're one of the elect, that over the course of your lifetime, God's grace will be irresistible? In other words, you will be saved. It just may not be this time you hear the gospel, but maybe next time, right? So that's what we were trying to figure out, is what does he mean by irresistible? Now, with what Stephen says to them there, at his martyrdom, that one, because he compares it to the prophets in the Old Testament, I know that's where the debate is there with that one. It's like, well, Stephen's not talking about salvation as we understand it today and as we are looking at it today. He's talking about them listening to the Word of God, which absolutely, we're all capable of not obeying the Word of God.
Correct.
Yeah, and Calvin would teach that too. So, but yeah, these go back and forth, right? These go back and forth. Go ahead. Yeah.
They said you could lose salvation, but did he tell us under what condition?
No.
I mean, if you just sin, you're not gonna be saved 5 minutes.
Right. Yeah. And that's the trick. Whenever you come across someone who's attacking you for believing in once saved, always saved, ask them, what does it take to lose your salvation? And they say, well, denial of Christ. If you deny your faith, then you lost your salvation. And then you say, so did Peter get lost when he denied Christ? And then from there, you can turn down and say, well, you deny Christ every time you choose sin over him. So, therefore, anytime you choose to sin, you would have lost your salvation. Which means you better not leave the altar of the church.
You better drown in the baptism.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Where that's going to lead to really quickly is where the Catholics get to with the last rites. That's where that was going to go real quick, right? The salvation being lost due to sin. Yeah.
And they always use the verse in Hebrews chapter 6, that it is impossible to renew them to repentance.
Yeah.
So once you lose it, you can't get it back.
That's right.
So,
Yeah, so in Hebrews, if they use the verse in Hebrews chapter 6, it says it's a whole big deal there, get the verses, but it's like it's impossible for those who have tasted the heavenly light, seen the. It gives these descriptions which we would generally interpret as, oh, well, this person is a Christian.
right.
And then says it is impossible for those who've done that, if they continue to sin, to be renewed back to the grace of God again. Which what Hebrews 6 is really saying is, if they did lose their salvation, it could never be regained. Ever. Like, once you had salvation, it was lost, that was it. There's no chance of ever being saved again. There is no denomination that teaches that. Not even Catholics teach that. Right? Even your most hardline Yeah. Trey, you paying attention? Okay, good. We don't curate you today. Is that right, Trey? Yes. Yes, all right, good deal. Okay, so to sum up the Calvin and Arminian thing, Joseph Arminius, it's not Joseph, it's James. James, yes. Okay, Arminius did not, why does he do all these things? Okay, so at the end of the day, what's the deal here? Arminius did not want to make God the author of sin, nor man an automaton, right, so robot. He thought that these modifications of Calvinism would eliminate those dangers to that theology. Okay, so that's the motivation behind his divergence from Calvinism. Okay, now, most of your Baptists today will be somewhere down the middle or even slightly towards Arminius side of this debate, right? Understand that 200 years ago, or even 100 years ago, that would have not been the case. Okay? So, all right, with all that being said, there's your alternative that shows up in Calvinism. It shows up, I know that James Arminian would have considered himself a student of Calvin, especially in the beginning. I don't know if they actually ever met. I think Calvin might have been dead by the time he shows up. Someone look up the year Calvin went for me.
The dates,
The Calvin died. Yeah, John Calvin, his birthday. Birthday. 1564. So yeah, they would have never had a discussion because Arminius was 4 years old when Calvin died. Okay? Huh? Okay. All right. So let's talk about what happens with the Reformed faith in Europe. Okay? So we have Lutheranism over here, right? Like right here, happening right in here. And remember, you have Islam is right in here, trying to destroy Austria and creep into the rest of Europe. So you got, again, Lutheranism is making its way up through Germany. Okay? Calvin and Geneva starts here, but as we're about to talk about, it's going to spread very quickly. Okay? So first things first, into France. Okay? Geneva would actually train up over 200 ministers in the Reformed faith to take the Reformed faith into France. Okay? And this is where we start to get into the idea of the 30 Years' War and what's going to happen. Okay? All right, so Francis I, who ruled France between 1515 and 1547, engaged in almost constant struggle between the Spanish over the rule of Italy. French interference in the Italian affairs brought about the rise of biblical humanism because Frenchmen studied in Italy and developed enthusiasm for sources of knowledge from the past. Right? By the way, we're going to see this with John Knox, who we're going to talk about up here, right? Those guys that sound real funny when they talk. And then also Zwingli, who's right here. They're both going to be military chaplains. So Luther and Calvin are students of law before their salvation and go into, obviously go into theology. And then Zwingli and John Knox are both going to be military chaplains who would travel around with the soldiers and stuff, right? Okay. All right, Lutheran influence in France, right? So it became another factor in the rise of the Reformation in France. You say, Matt, wait a minute. We're talking about the Reformation in France. France is going to stay Catholic. We're going to find out why it stays Catholic. The upper middle class merchants of the town and the workers of the town and the country were dissatisfied with the monopoly of social and political positions that nobility and clergy had through the Roman Church. So in other words, the middle class has found itself butting heads with Roman Catholicism. Because remember, the bishops and all the cardinals in the hierarchy of Rome, that was all the aristocracy, right? Those were all the elites, the nobles, the wealthiest people were put into those places. All right. So Francis, who was the ruler of France, 1515-1547, alarmed at the rise of Protestant ideas, decided to use force to stop the continued spread of these heretical ideas. In 1525, a group of I don't know how to say that. You with me there on page 309?
That's close enough now.
MEAUX. Where's our French people? Mach. No, German.
No.
Oh, okay, there we go. All right. Anyways, a group of Mo, I guess we'll go with, was scattered, and many fled from France, right? Let's see. Let's see. So about 1521, this is taking place in France. 1521, 1525. The Catholic monarchs of France are trying to stop Protestantism, right? The movement in France lacked effective leadership, but those who adopted the princes of the Reformation emphasized the authority of the Bible for their faith and their morals and the doctrine of justification by faith. What do you do with that? The fervent? What's that name there? Lefebvre. Lefebvre? We're just having fun now. Okay, anyways, that French guy, his Bible, so he translates the Bible into French, right? The Lefebvre translates the Bible into French, which is largely based on the Latin Vulgate, was distasteful to many, and so Pierre Olivetan, we'll go with that, who had been influenced by Calvin at Orleans, made a new translation. Okay, so again, you see the same pattern in the Reformation. Bible gets put into the language of the people. The Reformation spreads. Right? Turns out that when people can get the Bible, they can read it for themselves. They look at the Catholic Church, like, wait a minute, this does not look like that. Right? We need to fix this. Same thing happens in France. Okay, although the strength of the French Reformation at first was drawn from the ideas of the biblical humanists and Luther, the conversion of John Calvin provided a writer who was able to popularize the Reformation faith. In 1532, the Waldenses of southern France adopted Calvinism. So we talked about the Waldenses, right? They were down here. They were around when John Huss was over here, the forerunners of the Reformation. The Pope would actually send crusades to wipe out the Waldenses, right? But they survive all of that, and what it just tells us here is that the Waldenses are actually going to convert to the Reformed branch of the Reformation, right? So that's what happens to those guys in the end. They become Reformed. All right.
A group of Waldensians settled in North Carolina, and there's actually an event center.
Yes.
I don't know the
Is that what you got? It's funny you mention that because the book actually talks about them running to North and South Carolina.
It's on I-40.
It's on that 40? There you go. How about that? Okay. Okay. And remember, Calvin's book, his first major publication, what was it called? Josh, what was it called? Yeah, exactly. Calvin's first major publication, what was it called? From last week. You can still read it today. Your dad's already read it. Your mom's probably read it too. You better read it. The Institutes of the Christian Religion, Christian Faith. Okay? Calvin's Institute. He wrote that as an apologetic to the King of France. In other words, he wrote that to the King of France saying, hey, listen, Protestantism isn't that bad. Read this. Right? That's kind of what he did there. Trying to explain it to the King of France. Okay. Anyway, so Calvin is going to become very popular there in France. Okay, it was persecution of French Protestants that caused Calvin to issue the first edition of the Institutes in 1536, an apologetic to defend the French Christians as loyal subjects to suggest that the persecutions had stopped. Right? So the King of France is trying to stomp out Protestantism in France because he's Catholic, very devout Catholic. Calvin writes the Institutes as an apologetic to that, saying, look, these Protestants, they're not going to be a bunch of troublemakers, they're not going to be a bunch of rebels, they're going to be faithful, loyal servants to the nation. All right, it says here, he was as much a leader of the French Protestants as he was those in Geneva. And understand this, Calvin is Geneva, right? So that's a big deal. Okay, over 150 pastors ambassadors trained in Geneva were sent to France between 1555 and 1556. Despite the wave of severe persecution that began in 1538, unorganized Protestants of different theological shades of opinion were consolidated into an organized, self-conscious group by 1559 with aid from Geneva. So Calvin's kind of headquartering this from Geneva. They're sending preachers out and they're trying to pull the Protestants together there. You say, man, why are they doing this? Why is it such a big deal that the Protestants are trying to link together? At this stage in the Reformation, all of Europe has pretty much broken out into war. And the war has become Catholics versus Protestants, right? And then it's going to become Protestants versus Protestants as well before it's all said and done. So by this time, the 30 Years' War, what would be called the 30 Years' War, has begun. So understand that organizing and pulling together is very much an act of survival, just as much as it is an act of keeping the movement alive. Okay. Early in the reign of Henry II, about 400,000 French population were Protestant, according to one estimate. The great French admiral, oh boy, Gaspard de Coligny? I don't know. You go for it, Mike. Coligny, yeah, let it roll off, like pasta. Right? Poor French, okay.
Hold on.
Cologne, okay.
That's what she said.
Cologne,
She
is it
should
Cologne?
say it loud.
So the Y there, you're the person that need to be going to for French. Okay, is it Gaspard de Cologne? Okay, we'll do that. Okay, by the way, admirals are going to play a huge part in Protestantism. We'll talk more about that. But anyways, great French admiral became a Protestant, right? Now that's a huge deal. The reason why is because the admirals, the guys who control the fleets, control the colonies, right? And they also, admirals they're up there in ranking and power. So when you got an admiral who's now Protestant, that's huge. Okay? Anyways, he became a Protestant, and then in 1559, the First National Synod, which marked the first evidences of a national organization, was held in Paris. The Synod adopted the Gallican Confession of Faith, the first draft of which had been prepared by Calvin. The confession was essentially a summary of his theology. After 1560, the Protestants became known as the, you want to go with that one? Huguenots? Huguenots, okay, there we go. Is that your North Carolinians? No, that's not that. That was the Waldenses. Waldenses to Huguenots to North Carolina. We got it. Okay. Okay. Anyways, the origin of the name is uncertain, but it became a badge of honor among the French Calvinistic Protestants. The Huguenots became so powerful and so well organized that they formed a kingdom within a kingdom. Realization of this situation by the government of France brought about a transition from the government's policy of steady, fierce, bloody persecution between 1538 and 1562 to a policy of religious war to restore France to the bosom of Rome. Between 1562 and 1598, there were 8 fierce wars and massacres. The terrible massacre of St. Bartholomew began in 1572 by the murder of, what did you say it was? Cologne, yeah. So they would murder that French admiral, and that would trigger a war, okay? Between 2,000 and 3,000 were massacred in Paris on the night of August 24th of 1572. From 6,000 to 8,000 were killed in the provinces, and their property was seized by the Roman Catholics. The Roman Catholics had been inspired to this bloody deed by Catherine de Medici, who had strong influence over the king, Charles. You'll have me in my Roman numerals. 1 and the next is what? 9? Okay, Charles the 9th. Okay? So, why does France stay Catholic and not become Protestant? Because the Catholics killed them all. That's why. In case you missed all that, that's what's happening. The ones they didn't kill would jump on boats and go across the pond, right? To these new things called colonies over there in this great new world that they found, right? So 6,000 to 8,000 people were killed in the provinces, 2,000 to 3,000 people massacred in Paris. 8 wars that break out in France. This is what Reformation looks like in France. Okay? By 1593, Henry of Navarre, the leader of the Huguenots, became a Roman Catholic and ruled as Henry the Fourth. I believe that's for 1B, 4? Yeah. Yeah. So, the leader of them converts to Catholicism and becomes the king of France. But, watch this. He issued an Edict of Nantes in 1598, which granted freedom of religion to the Huguenots so that they formed a tolerant state within the French state. Okay, so within France, there's a Protestant nation now. They're like, okay guys, let's all stop killing each other and get along. Okay? They were allowed to keep garrisons in several of the 200 towns in their hands. So the Huguenots controlled 200 towns within France. You paying attention, Trey? You better. Alright. Alright, this Charter of Liberty protected Protestantism in France until the charter was revoked in 1685. When Louis the, I believe that's 14, X1B, 14, right? When Louis the 14th, who desired to have one state, one ruler, and one faith, came to power. Then, about 200,000 Huguenots were forced to flee from France to Switzerland, England, Prussia, Holland, South Africa, and North and South Carolina. So, there's your Carolinians. Does that make sense? Okay. There you go. All right. In North America, right? So, once Louis the 14th takes over, about 1685, they take off, right? That's all going to become very important because when does America start its thing against Great Britain? Trey, birthday, Declaration of Independence, what day? What year? Tell me the year. What year? Josh, Declaration of Independence, 1776, yes. So, by 1685, there's 200,000 Protestants that flee France and come to America, right? So, in public school, they would sum all this up simply by saying, yeah, it's because of all the religious wars in Europe that so many other people got on the boats and risked their lives and came over to America. It's a lot more complicated than just people were dying in Europe because of religion, right? Okay, so they flee, and because they were skilled artisans and professional men of the middle class, the loss of the Huguenots was a serious economic blow to France. This loss helped to bring about her defeat by England in the struggle for the colonies in the 18th century. Since that time, Reformed Presbyterianism has not had much influence in France, and the Protestants have been a small minority of the population. Okay? So, long story short, what's the war that's going to take place between England and France over the colonies? Trey? War between England and France over the colonies, what war was it? Nope, not even close. French and Indian War, which the French and Indians did not fight each other. We are great about misnaming stuff, you know that, right? Bunker Hill didn't take place on Bunker Hill, it took place on Freed's Hill, right? The French and Indian War wasn't between the French and the Indians, it was the French and the Indians against the British, right? So, we just like doing that, just to make it hard. Iceland, that wasn't us, that was Vikings. That's been done for a while. But yes, I agree, they're misnamed. They did that on purpose.
Yeah, because Iceland, they wanted people to think that that was the place on the ice and had no, like, there, and no nature there,
There you go.
and no area.
You know what? I gotta pay attention. How about that? Okay. All right. So, anyways, when these guys would leave, it would hurt France, right? It turns out that the Protestant / Reformed men were highly productive members of society with high moral standards and high principles that they lived on, right? And whenever you take all of those people out of society, the society is going to crumble and weaken. And that's exactly what would happen with France, okay? All right. Should we talk about Jansenism? I think it's good. Long story short, Jansenism is a Roman Catholic move within France as a way to try to recover some purity within the Roman Catholic Church. So in other words, to get rid of all the drunkenness and all the craziness that they're all known for Catholic Church does have to respond to the Reformation, right? It's more than just wars and them trying to kill them all. It's more than just that. They have to respond to the corruption within their own church eventually. All of Europe's going to break out in war because of it before they finally step up and say, hey, you know what? All of these people, millions of people were saying we got a major problem. Maybe we better step back and have a look at ourselves and see what we have here. And so that would be called the Counter-Reformation. Is what that's going to be called in that sense. Okay? So you got the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, and you got the Reformed faith inside of that. Don't get them all mixed up, right? Lots of reforming going on. Okay? All right. Yeah, we'll jump through those ones. Okay. Luther. So let's talk about Luther for a second. What's going on in Germany? So all that's happening in France, right? Okay. Luther lost support of the peasant class of the Rhine Valley by his uncompromising opposition to the peasants' revolt. Many peasants became Anabaptists. We'll talk more about that when we haven't got there yet. We've got to get this one before we get to Anabaptists. With the coming of Calvinism, those who were financially better off turned to Calvinism. Earlier in 1530, 3 cities of the Rhine area and Strasbourg presented their Tetrapolitan Confession to the Diet of Augsburg. So in other words, along the Rhine, Calvinism starting to spread along the Rhine River, which that's this one, right? Where's the Rhine? Is this one the Rhine, or is the Rhine over here? Good, I don't feel bad. No one else knows. Is this the Rhine? Oh yeah, good luck. We just got way too many lines. Over here? It doesn't even show us rivers. Yeah, it's alright. Along the Rhine River, we got it, Eastern Germany. You think you know as much as I know about World War II, I know about the Rhine. Anyway, okay. World War XI. Did y'all see that?
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Ilhan Omar reading her script, whatever speech that she obviously didn't write, she mentioned something about World War XI instead of calling it World War II because of Muslims. That happened this week, by the way, guys. So stay tuned. We skipped about 9 somewhere in there. Y'all know that, right? Okay. That's just about as dumb as the person who said amen, a woman. You remember that guy? Closed his prayer with that. Literally closed his prayer with that. Yeah. Guys. Those are our leaders, people. Those are our leaders. Okay. So anyways, Calvinism starts to show up a little bit in Germany as well. Okay. Calvinism also made gains in the Palatinate, whose ruler was the elector of Frederick the Elector III. The Palatinate, I believe, is going to be right here. We have to look that up to know for sure, but I think it's northwest of Germany, I think. Anyways, okay, so the Reformed faith, Calvinism makes its way into there as well. After a public disputation in 1560, Frederick decided in favor of Calvinism. It was officially adopted in 1563. It became the official creed of the German Reformed churches. The German Reformed faith was finally established after a short Lutheran interlude. The University of Heidelberg became a center of Calvinism. Okay? So, don't think of the Reformed branch of the Reformation as a little bitty piece of it. It's not. It's probably the largest. It is the largest piece of it. Okay. Hungary is also going to have a massive amount of Reformed influence in it as well, without jumping too much into that. Hungary's got lots of big problems on their border because the Islamic world is now united under the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire is massive. It is the largest empire in the world at the time that all this is taking place. It's huge. Ottoman Empire is Muslim, right? And they're by every stretch that we could call them today, they're radical Muslim. We conquer you, you convert, or we kill you. That's simple. Okay? At bare minimum, if we do let you live, we can arrest you and throw you in jail at any time and take all your stuff. Man, you better not be talking about Jesus. Right? right? That's their temperate version of Islam in the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottoman Empire in the Muslim world is at a halt right here between Austria and Hungary. These Central Europeans, I know we think of this as Eastern European, right? We think of this as Eastern Europe. It's not. This is Eastern Europe. These guys right here lost hundreds of thousands of men during this time period fighting Muslims. Okay? Remember, Vienna, scroll down on Austria for me, right here. See, whoa. Okay, where's their cities? Okay, zoom up a little, I think it's further south. Oop. Anybody see Vienna? Should be right in here, right? There you go. First one, capital of Austria. There you go. That's how far the Muslims would make it. Okay? Slowly scroll up so we can see that. That's how far they made it into Europe before they were stopped. On the eastern side. On the western side, remember, they made it across here one time and were defeated by Charles Martel. Right? So everything from here to there is under huge threat of Islam. All the time. Meanwhile, the Reformation is all taking place in here, which is preoccupying all these people from supporting against Muslims. Because they're all killing each other. So, very dangerous time to be alive, to say the least, during the Reformation. Okay? Okay, now, let's talk about Scotland. You know where Scotland is? Let's put yep, there you go. Okay. Scotland. Okay, so it turns out that the English and the French don't get along. Anybody know that? Yeah. So they fought a war that's called the 100 Years' War. Right? For 100 years, off and on, the English and the French were killing each other. And then it turned out that one of the princesses of Scotland would marry one of the kings of France. Guess what? Since everything's a monarchy, now France has a back door into England. And England doesn't like that. And all this is happening around the time the guy by the name of Edward I. If you watch the movie Braveheart, terrible historical movie, but still fun to watch. That is Edward Longshanks. Okay? He's a ruthless guy, and he likes killing Scottish people. That's his favorite pastime, is killing them. Okay? And anyways, shortly, it's during this time that England realizes that they got a problem now because France, who they're constantly fighting with, and by the way, we're used to England just being over here on this side of the river, right? You know, we're used to them just being over here. During the 100 Years' War, almost all the battles are fought here in what we call France, right? England would lose the 100 Years' War in the sense that they would lose all their territory in France, what we call France today, right? Okay. Like all of the northern coastline here was French, and then, was English. And then the coastline down here as well was English as well, right? And they're constantly fighting back and forth over all of that, right? Okay, so now we got a marriage between France and Scotland, and now we can take the war to England itself, I think. So, Edward I tried unsuccessfully to bring Scotland under the English crown. This is the story of Braveheart, right? He's doing everything he can to try to get Scotland to submit. Scotland made common cause with England's great enemy, France, right? As a result, England could always count on the flank attack from the Scots in the north whenever it went to war with France. So it was just kind of a given thing that if the 100-Year War picks back up in France, then we're going to get attacked by the Scots in the north, right? So they're having to fight a two-front war. That is less than ideal, right? And ask Hitler about that. It doesn't work out too well. Okay. It was not until the Reformation, which brought both countries into the Protestant fold, that relations became better. The common fight between the Episcopacy and the Presbyterianism during the first half of the 17th century helped heal the old breach between the two states after both were brought under one ruler in 1603. Anybody know who that ruler is? Google it. Who's the ruler of England in 1603? She was pretty famous. Same thing. Do what? also where you get your King James Bible. Yes. Okay, so, anyways, long story short, the Protestant Reformation would actually heal the big giant rift and years of hatred here between England and Scotland, right? Because they didn't fight each other for hundreds of years by the time the Reformation shows up. 1300 is when Edward the Longshanks was doing his thing, right? When he did, cut up William Wallace and post body parts of him all across England and Scotland. That was in 1300. We're talking about the 15 and 1600s by the time they would start to reconcile. So over 200 years of them fighting and killing each other, this would happen. All right. Politics were dominated by religion during the Scottish Reformation. But in England, religion had been secondary to political considerations. Remember, Henry VIII, that guy? That's how, Henry VIII is how the Reformation is going to come to England. He wants a divorce, Pope says no, and he says, fine, I'm now the head of the church and not you. What are you going to do about it? You don't have a Spanish Armada anymore, come get me. Right? And they don't. So, but Henry's daughters would continue the fight back and forth over whether or not England is going to stay Protestant or go back to Catholicism. So, anyway, all right, we'll get there. But yeah, in England it's more of a political thing, whereas in Scotland it's definitely more of a spiritual thing, right? There's the drive in Scotland is to get back to the roots of what the New Testament says. Politics were dominated by religion during the Scottish Reformation, but in England the religion had been secondary to political considerations. The barons and the good burghers of the middle class in Scotland united under one man by the name of John Knox against the crown to bring about the reform. In England, the Reformation had been created above the law, from above by the law of the ruler, right? So in other words, because Henry VIII said so, we're now Protestant, right? That's how it went in England. However, in Scotland, it went from the bottom up. It was the people saying, time out, we don't like this Catholicism thing anymore. We like what this John Knox guy is saying. We're going to go with him. And so it went from the bottom up in Scotland. Okay? It is little wonder that the Reformation in Scotland was more radical than that of the one in England. In no other area except for Geneva was the influence of Calvinism so strong. Lack of a strong ruler in Scotland had created many local areas under the leadership of a strong clans and strong chieftains. Small wonder that in this anarchic situation, morals and religion had deteriorated. And the Catholic Church, concubinage and drunkenness and simony and greed for wealth were commonplace, right? Coupled with disregard for the people characterized by the leaders of the Roman, coupled with disregard of the people characterized the leaders of the Roman Church in Scotland, right? So in other words, all the leaders of the Catholic Church in Scotland are all doing a bunch of dumb stuff that they shouldn't be doing, right? They're all belly up in sin. And the Scottish people look at that and say, yeah, that's not okay, right? I wish I had my Scottish accent. You know, you're a good Scottish accent. On that, right? All right, okay. All right, one positive case of the Scottish Reformation was the Lutheran teaching of Patrick Hamilton, 1503 to 1528, who had studied at Marburg and Wittenberg, right? Was that Wittenberg? Hamilton's emphasis on justification by faith and his assertion that the Pope was the Antichrist so aroused the authorities that he was burned to death in 1528. Right? So by as early as 1528, we've established that the Pope is Antichrist. That wouldn't change until about 50 years ago. In fact, in many Baptist circles, it's still the case. The Pope is the Antichrist. We can get there pretty quick, I think, especially with what this one's doing now. Okay. All right. So, yeah. Patrick Hamilton burned to death in 1528, burned to the stake for proclaiming the Pope was the Antichrist. George Weishart, 1513 to 1546, also began teaching Protestant doctrine and was burned at the stake for it. He exerted considerable influence on the spiritual development of John Knox. Copies of Tyndale's New Testament brought to Scotland by Scottish merchants also had their effect on the promotion of Protestant ideas. So remember, Tyndale, what did he do? Put the Bible in English, right? And then also alienated from the royal family when Mary Stuart was sent to France for her education and when she married the young heir to the French throne. The Scots were worried that Scotland should become a part of France and French dominions because of this marriage. They were so antagonized by the lax morality of Frenchmen in Scotland that the failure of the Roman Church and the spread of the theology of the Reformation created an atmosphere favorable to the coming of the Scottish Reformation. Right? So it turns out that the Frenchmen had pretty lax morals, that the Roman Catholics in Scotland had pretty lax morals, and the Scottish are ready to get back to, or ready to go to a form of Puritanism. Right? That's what's coming of this. In the meantime, the man who was to establish the Reformation in Scotland was being prepared for his task, John Knox, 1514 to 1572. So he lived to a ripe old age of, what's that, 58? 68, 58. 58. He lived to 58. Yes?
It's 6.
Huh?
He told me late at 6.
Wow.
Yes,
All right, let's finish up Scotland. We'll finish up Scotland here real quick, okay? John Knox was courageous and sometimes harsh man who feared no one except for God. Typical of a Scottish person, I guess. He was educated at the University of St. Andrews and ordained in the priesthood in 1536. He became a follower of Weishaupt, that guy who was just burned at the stake and proclaimed that the Pope was the Antichrist, and preached to Protestant soldiers in the garrison of St. Andrews until the French captured him. For 19 months he served as a galley slave in a French warship until he was released through the exchange of prisoners. Edward IV of England offered him a bishopric of Rochester, but Knox refused it. Knox then became a royal chaplain. When Mary Tudor ascended to the English throne, he fled to Europe, where he ministered to the religious exiles at Frankfurt. He was much influenced by Calvin. To him, Calvin was that noble servant of God, quote unquote, was his name. So, Mary Tudor, anybody know what her nickname would be? You guys like to play games in the bathroom with the mirror? Bloody Mary, yes. Mary Tudor would become nicknamed as Bloody Mary, right? Why was she called Bloody Mary? Because she decided that England needed to be Catholic again. That her father, who decided that he was now the head of the church, was in fact a heretic, and that England needed to be Catholic. So she decided she was going to force convert England back to Protestantism in the same way that the French did. We're just going to kill them all off. And this is why she got the nickname Bloody Mary. Okay? So, all the Protestants, that's what they start to do. The same thing that the Huguenots did in France. They start jumping on boats, going to the colonies. Okay? They also start fleeing across the pond here to the Netherlands, which we'll have to talk about the next time. Okay. And let's talk about the last of it here. A number of Scottish nobles were disgusted with the French influence in Scotland and the idolatry of the Congregation of Satan, which is now what they're calling the Roman Catholic Church. So we've now got the Antichrist as the Pope, Congregation of Satan as the Catholic Church. Anyways, the Scottish nobles, right? United Clowns. They met in Edinburgh in 1557. These lords made a covenant to use their lives and possessions to establish the Word of God in Scotland. At this juncture, Knox in 1559 returned to Scotland as a fiery preacher of Calvinistic thought. When Mary Stuart and her husband became rulers of France, and French soldiers were brought into Scotland, the Scots appealed to Elizabeth, the new Queen of England, for aid. Elizabeth, a skillful diplomat, hesitated to assist the people in revolt against their monarch, against their sovereign monarch. Further, she disliked Knox because in 1558 he had published a tract against the Scottish Lady Regent, Mary Tudor, entitled "The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women." How's that for a title? good old John Knox. Yeah. Let me read that name for you again so you get it. Ready? His book here, his tract. "The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women." That's his title. Unfortunately for him, the next few rulers of England would be women. Whoops. They kind of hold a grudge. Turns out. subversion of good order and all justice and equity. Those are his words. However, his words only. However, because French troops in Scotland were a threat to English security, she sent money and a fleet, and in 1560, the Treaty of Edinburgh in 1560 provided that only a harmless token of force of 120 French troops could stay in Scotland. The Frenchmen could not hold public office in Scotland, and that Francis II, Mary Stuart's husband, was not to engage in war against England. So everybody wins, right? England then had to fight France, Scotland then become French. All of these things are great and good. This ended the French control in Scotland and left the lords of the congregation as the Scottish nobility interested in reform were called, right? So those who were interested in the Reformation in Scotland were called the lords of the congregation. Free to promote the cause of the religious Reformation. Okay, so long story short, because of John Knox and his whole go, they would become Protestant, right? Heavily influenced by Catholicism. So by the time the dust settles for the Reformation, the Reformed faith, not Lutheranism and not the Anabaptist, would have the most strength in Europe, right? And also, a lot of them have jumped the pond, so they wouldn't be killed, right? Which means they have pretty good influence over here. Over here, you probably studied them in school and they were called Puritans. Okay? It's 6 o'clock. So, who's got something before I let you go?
Was John Knox the military leader that you spoke about earlier? A military chaplain?
He's a chaplain, yes. John Knox is a chaplain, and Gord Zwingli is a chaplain as well. So you got 2 chaplains and 2 lawyers that are the main leaders in the Reformation. Turns out that whole chaplaincy thing would come in real big handy when it comes time for you to stay alive, because you got military men there to defend you, so you don't get put to the stake. That would save Zwingli and John Knox. How many of y'all heard John Knox for today? All right, 2 of us. Good job. Michael, I'm just going to assume you didn't raise your hand. Okay, we got it. All right. Josh, how many other John Knox? All right. Any other questions? No. Then we have it. All right. Next week we talk about the Netherlands, the Dutch guys. Talk money. Okay. And then we'll jump into Zwingli. Okay. Maybe we'll get to it next week.